The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet neighborhood of Sycamore Hills. Maggie Lawson adjusted the rear-view mirror, her sharp brown eyes scanning the road as she navigated familiar turns leading home. The trunk of her car was filled with neatly packed groceries, a fresh set of flowers sitting atop them, a small indulgence she allowed herself every Thursday. At 73, Maggie had spent decades building a life that was hers and hers alone. A retired history professor, she had taught generations of students the importance of resilience, knowledge, and self-respect. She was a woman who believed in order and dignity, and she carried herself as such. It wasn't until she turned onto Maplewood Lane that she noticed the police cruiser behind her. At first, she thought little of it. Maybe they were just patrolling. Maybe they weren't even looking at her. But when a flash of red and blue illuminated her rear-view mirror, a familiar, unwelcome tension settled in her chest. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel as she slowed to a stop by the curb. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't rolled through a stop sign. She wasn't doing anything wrong. And yet, with measured movements, Maggie reached for her purse where her license and registration sat neatly tucked inside. Before she could pull them out, a sharp rap on her window startled her. She turned her head and met the impassive stare of a uniformed officer, his sunglasses reflecting the evening light. Another officer stood behind her car, his hand resting a little too close to his holster. License and registration. The first officer's voice was flat, impersonal. No greeting. No explanation. Maggie exhaled, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. She had lived long enough to know the rules. Hands visible. No sudden movements. Nothing that could be misconstrued. "Good afternoon, officers," she said evenly, passing her documents through the window. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" The officer barely glanced at the papers before responding. "Your vehicle matches a description of a stolen car." A stolen car? Maggie's lips pressed together. She had owned the sedan for over a decade, had the registration papers approve it. Still, she knew arguing wouldn't get her anywhere. So she waited. The first officer took her documents and walked back toward his cruiser. The second one lingered. He peered into the back seat, scanning her neatly packed grocery bags as if he expected to find something incriminating. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge that wasn't quite aggressive, but wasn't friendly either. "The grocery store," Maggie replied smoothly, "just picking up a few things before heading home." The officer nodded, but there was something about the way he did it. Something that suggested he didn't quite believe her. "You live around here?" "I do." "Where at?" Maggie tilted her head slightly. "Officer" is as relevant to why I was stopped. The question shifted the air between them. The officer squared his shoulders slightly. "We're just making sure everything checks out," he said. Ah, those words. She had heard them before. Maggie remained composed, her expression unreadable as she watched the first officer return with her ID still in hand. His face was tighter now, his jaw clenched. "This car isn't coming back as stolen," he admitted. "But," and there it was, "we still need to verify a few things." Maggie arched an eyebrow. "Verify what exactly?" "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." The second officer moved closer, his hand hovering near his holster now. A silent warning. Maggie felt her pulse slow. Not speed up, slow, because she knew exactly what was happening. She had seen the stories. She had heard them. And now she was living one. But she wasn't about to let them dictate how this would go. She exhaled, reached for the door handle, and unlatched it. The second officer stepped back slightly, like he expected her to do something sudden. She swung the door open in one deliberate motion, stepping onto the pavement with a quiet grace that belied the tension in the air. "You have any weapons on you?" the first officer asked. Maggie blinked. She was wearing a loose cardigan over a simple blouse and slacks. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was armed. And yet, they were treating her like a threat. "I don't," she said, her voice carrying just the slightest hint of something heavier now. Something bordering on insulted. The officer gave a short nod, then tilted his chin toward the trunk. "Mind if we take a look inside?" And there it was. Maggie locked eyes with him. "Do you have probable cause?" The second officer shifted uncomfortably. The first one, however, held his ground. "We're just making sure everything checks out." That phrase again. Maggie inhaled deeply, then smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't polite. It was a kind of smile that said, "I see exactly what you're doing, and I'm not playing along." Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out her phone. Slow, intentional. Her thumb moved over the screen, scrolling through her recent calls. Then she tapped a name. She lifted the phone to her ear, waited a few seconds, then spoke. "Hey, baby," she said, her voice carrying just the faintest trace of amusement. "I'm fine, but these officers here seem to think I'm a car thief." The shift was immediate. The first officer's face twitched, a flicker of hesitation, confusion, concern. The second officer was glancing between them now, suddenly uncertain. And then Maggie dropped the bomb. "Oh, I'll hand him the phone," she said, extending it toward the first officer. "The U.S. Attorney General would like to speak with you." For a long moment, the only sound was a faint hum of distant traffic and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Neither officer moved. Maggie's outstretched hand remained steady, her phone resting lightly in her palm as she waited. The first officer, Bradley, she noted from his badge, hesitated. His fingers twitched at his side, as if deciding whether to take the call. The second officer shifted on his feet, glancing toward his partner for direction. "You don't want to take the call?" Maggie asked, raising a brow. Still, they didn't answer. Then a small but commanding voice echoed through the speaker. "Mom, what's going on?" "Put me on speaker." Maggie turned the phone slightly so that both officers could hear. "You're on," she said, her voice still calm. "This is U.S. Attorney General Jonathan Lawson. To whom am I speaking?" That did it. Bradley's spine stiffened. The second officer, a younger man whose name tag read Simmons, took another step back. The confidence they had displayed moments ago drained from their expressions. Bradley cleared his throat. Sir, this is Officer Bradley with the Sycamore Hills PD." "I see." Jonathan's voice carried an edge now, sharp and controlled. "And tell me, Officer Bradley, why are you detaining my mother?" Bradley's mouth opened and closed once before he settled on an answer. "We were conducting a routine stop," he said. "A routine stop?" Jonathan's tone sharpened. "You pulled over a 73-year-old woman, forced her out of her car, and asked to search her vehicle without probable cause. That's not routine, officer." Simmons was suddenly very interested in his shoes. Bradley, however, squared his shoulders and attempted to salvage the situation. "We may have overstepped," he admitted, though the word sounded forced. Maggie didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She had taught middle school boys with more conviction than this man. "Overstepped," Jonathan repeated. "That's an interesting way to describe harassment." Bradley inhaled deeply through his nose. He didn't like this. He wanted to regain control of the situation, but the balance of power had shifted, and he knew it. "Ma'am, we were just doing our jobs," Simmons interjected, his voice quieter than before. Maggie tilted her head slightly. "No," she said simply. "You weren't." Silence. Jonathan spoke again, his voice low and unyielding. "I want your badge numbers. Both of you." Bradley hesitated, but he wasn't in control anymore. Slowly, reluctantly, he pulled a small notepad from his pocket, scribbled something down, and tore the page free. He handed it to Maggie. Simmons followed suit, his hands shaking slightly. Maggie took the papers and folded them neatly, slipping them into her pocket without looking. "You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs," Jonathan said. "And trust me, this won't be forgotten." Bradley swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing. Maggie exhaled deeply, then turned back toward her car. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. She moved with the same grace and poise she always had, because they had tried to strip that from her, and they had failed. She slid into her seat, shut the door, and rolled up the window. Bradley and Simmons took a collective step back. She placed her hands on the steering wheel, steady, composed. And then, without another word, she pulled away from the curb. The ride home was silent, but Maggie's mind was anything but. She should have been thinking about dinner, about the book she had been reading, about whether she remembered to buy the right kind of tea. Instead, she replayed the last 30 minutes in her head. How quickly things had escalated, how familiar it all felt, and how different it could have gone if she were someone else. Her son's name had saved her. But what about the ones who didn't have that safety net? What about the ones who never made it home? The question sat heavy in her chest as she pulled into her driveway. The house she had lived in for over 20 years looked the same as always, but somehow it didn't feel the same. She parked, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a moment. She let herself feel it, the frustration, the exhaustion, the disgust at the fact that even at 73, she still had to prove she belonged. Then she exhaled and opened the door, because she wasn't going to let two men with badges steal anything more from her than they already had. Inside, the quiet comfort of her home wrapped around her. She set her purse down, took off her cardigan, and reached for the kettle. As she placed it on the stove, her phone buzzed. A message from Jonathan. "You okay?" Maggie stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. "I will be." She set the phone down and reached for the tea leaves. Because if she had learned anything in her 73 years, it was this. The world wasn't fair. Justice wasn't guaranteed. And dignity was something you had to fight to keep. But she wasn't going to stop fighting. Not today. Not ever. The next morning, Jonathan sat in his Washington, D.C. office, his fingers drumming against his desk. The call from Internal Affairs had already been made. The wheels were in motion. But that wasn't what kept him up the night before. It was a thought of how many other mothers had been in Maggie's position. Mothers who didn't have a direct line to power. He exhaled sharply, then reached for his phone. It was time to make some changes. Because next time, it might be someone without the right name. And they deserved justice, too.